Lecture 2, Organization and Weapons of the People's Liberation Army. This includes the People's Liberation Army Ground Forces, the People's Liberation Army Air Forces, and the People's Liberation Army Navy. The point of this lecture is to have you identify and be familiar with the instruments of military force that are used by the Chinese military. Now, there are different applications of this from an analytical point of view. Sometimes strategies are based on the possibilities created by the availability of certain technologies. At other times, technologies are driven by strategy. Strategy has certain goals. The goals are very often geographically determined, and then that drives procurement. So the purpose of this, since we're going to be discussing the different strategies and historical issues regarding China's security, is to have at least some knowledge of some of the equipment that the Chinese military uses. So originally China had its military regions and army groups, which are the equivalent of corps. Each corps is about 3 divisions, and divisions are between 10 and 15,000 soldiers. So it gives you an idea of where most of China's military army units were concentrated. But this was reorganized. Since 2016, we have theater commands, and this is far more oriented towards the likely future threats which emerge from the Pacific. And you can see the Eastern Theater Command, which is focused on Taiwan, and the Southern Theater Command would be focused on the South China Sea. Here you can see the military regions, the old military regions, but we're using this map because it depicts the different PLAAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force headquarters and main air bases across China. There are 150 Air Force bases across China. And here you can see the deployment of the main fleets across China. An important note is Hainan Island, which is south of Guangzhou, has Sanya naval base, which contains the ballistic missile submarines of China's fleet. These are the submarines that carry the ballistic missiles underwater. 2021 global military spending, you'll see that China spends about $300 billion, which is less than half of what the U.S. spends. But it should be noted that over half of U.S. spending is personnel costs. As well, the Chinese spend, it's estimated, more on domestic security than they do on military, the cost of their military forces. And you can see the other countries that it opposes, like India, UK, Russia. So Russia and India, for example, have very large militaries because they pay their soldiers far less than do most Western countries. Here you can see the militaries by size in 2021. China at 2.2 million, India at 1.5 million, the US at 1.4 million, North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, all of which are straining their economies, as well as Iran. And then you have South Korea, which has a military that's sustainable and not a large part of the budget. So China's army has drastically reduced since the last time I taught this lecture. They've lost about 25% of their force. They're down to 960,000, of which 800,000 are conscripts. So overwhelmingly, you have conscripts. However, a very small number of China's population that are registered are actually called up as conscripts. So a very small part of China's military actually serves. China could probably call up tens of millions if it was a general conflict. The Navy's about the same size as it was 10 years ago, 260,000, with a much smaller number of conscripts. The Air Force has no conscripts, and it's about the same size as it was. The Strategic Military Forces has increased by about 20,000 in the last 5 years. Now, most conscripts are actually volunteers. They are listed, and they basically get ahead of the system and join. There's been a decline in party membership in the People's Liberation Army. and the National Defense Reserve Force is in decline. So the Chinese use of mass infantry to deal with a Soviet invasion in the 1970s and 80s, it's no longer a requirement. Education details. The formal academy system in China comprises 116 schools participating in the National Defense Program, and they account for 50% of officers who are mostly from the hard sciences like engineering, while the other 50% come from 70 military academies that commission officers. 2. China's been technically training its conscripts in order to replace junior officers and create an NCO class. However, it's not clear how much autonomy the NCO class has. Number 3, 30% of the conscripts are urban and 70% are rural. And number 4, about 70% of the People's Liberation Army soldiers come from one-child families, and among combat troops, about 80% have been raised as only children. China has a history of amoral familism in the sense that the state has been relatively weak because Chinese focus on the family. Traditionally, this meant you'd had cousin marriages, and so people would put their allegiance in the family and not the state, and so the state was not very robust. China's communist regime tried to change this by having people put allegiance into the state and not the family, although this is a forever ongoing division of loyalties of the individual. There are, of course, Uyghur and Russian minority conscripts within the Chinese military because there are minorities, particularly in the far western portions of China, like Xinjiang province, along the border with the Russian Far East. This is the rank structure of the Chinese military. This was the original rifle used in the 50s and 60s, derived from the semi-automatic Soviet Simonov SKS rifle. It's the Type 56. It's now only used by militia, occasionally used for parade troops. It's a reserve rifle. This is a Type 56 Soviet AK-47, again derived from the Soviet AK-47 assault rifle, again reserve use. Type 81 assault rifle, reserve use. Type 81 Soviet RPD light machine gun, used in some units, derived from the Soviet RPD-44. Type 67 GPMG, this has been replaced by another machine gun. DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun, this is a Soviet era weapon, no longer in use by China. So between 2003 and 2020, China used the QBZ-95 assault rifle bullpup design, and this was replaced. In 2020, China began introducing the QBZ-191 assault rifle. So variations of the earlier assault rifle design. Here we have, for elite units, the submachine gun variant with a smaller round, the QCW-05. Here is the section suppression weapon, QBB-95 light machine gun. Here's the QJ-88 light machine gun. Looks like it's on a tripod for sustained long-range accurate fire. Type 80 GPMG, which is derived from the Soviet PKMS. This is the W-85 12.7mm heavy machine gun. This is the Type 88 5.8mm QBZ-95 sniper rifle, bullpup design. This is the QBJ-10 12.7mm sniper rifle, also used for anti-vehicle. This is the Type 87 QJ-87 35mm automatic grenade launcher. So it's like the American Mark 19 or the Soviet AGS-17. It'll fire basically a hand grenade sized explosive fragmentary device several thousand meters. This is the LG-3 40mm grenade launcher, which is obviously the knockoff of the American Mark 19. Here's the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade used to destroy tanks and armored vehicles. This is the Type 56 75mm recoilless rifle, of which there are still 3,966 in service. They're very useful because you can modify the rounds that go in them, and many countries still use the recoilless rifle. PF-98 120mm anti-tank rocket launcher. China has some of these. The HJ-8 anti-tank guided missile. China has 450 of these. Many of these are vehicle mounted on wheeled vehicles and tracked vehicles. It's essentially a missile that can destroy a tank, and you'd operate it off of a lighter vehicle. The lighter vehicle would go into a hull down position. In other words, it would go behind a small mound. It would pop up, fire the rocket, and hopefully the rocket would make contact with the tank before the tank or the target turned and fired a round or machine guns back. Here's the HJ-10 anti-tank guided missile on a tracked vehicle. China's got about 200 of these. Again, these are particularly useful because they're very long range. The question is, for the 3,000 or 4,000 meter range of the missiles, are these forces going to be deployed in that kind of geography? Certainly in Taiwan, you're not going to have open fields like that. You have a lot of built-up terrain. You've got a lot of mounds between the rice paddies in Taiwan. So this would be far better used in a desert environment, or in the Russian Far East, or in the central plains of China. Here's the HN-5B Manpad. It's a surface-to-air missile. It's basically a copy of the Soviet Strela. This is the FN-6 Manpad. Again, another system. It's not really meant to shoot down aircraft as much as keep them away. So if low-flying aircraft, ground strike aircraft, or helicopters come nearby, these rockets fly off. This is the weapons distribution in a squad of 10 Class A Chinese infanteers or Marines using the older assault rifle. So you'll see in the top you've got one person with an anti-tank weapon, heavy. You've got two individuals with lighter disposable anti-tank weapons, and well, just about everybody's got a light anti-tank weapon. You've got a light machine gun, and everyone else is equipped with the assault rifle. And so that's a section normally headed by a master corporal or a sergeant in Western militaries. So we get into anti-tank weapons. This is a Type 86 100mm anti-tank gun, of which China has 1,308. Most other armies no longer have anti-tank guns because they cannot defeat the special laminate armor on the front of tanks. And they're much heavier, much bulkier than an anti-tank rocket, as you can imagine. So most armies have discarded these systems. Here's an anti-tank gun crew. Now, modern armored vehicles are required to move infantry on the battlefield, and infantry are very important because despite drones, people inside tanks can't see well outside, so they need the cooperation of infantry to take out broken terrain, such as enemies hiding in the forest, in a little hilly area, or inside fortifications. So this would carry the soldiers safely through the battlefield against small arms fire and artillery to the target, and normally they move in support of tanks. This is the WZ-501 ZBD-86, of which China still has 1,250, and is basically a copy of the Soviet BMP. This is the ZSD-89 APC, of which China's got 1,750. This is one in service in Sri Lanka. This is China's more modern APC. This is the ZSD-63 APC, of which China still has 950. These are China's first APCs. They're meant for the smaller stature of Chinese soldiers at the time, so they're no longer as comfortable. They were sold in large numbers, particularly the Middle East. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had a lot of these in 1991. This is the ZL-92 armored personnel carrier, wheeled. China's got 700 of these. This is the ZSL-93 APC. China's got 50 of these. Again, this is in the service of the Sri Lankan Army. This is the ZBL-08 infantry fighting vehicle, of which China's got 2,500. So it's got a turret with a machine gun, and it carries a section of soldiers safely and quickly on the battlefield in support of an armored operation or independently. This is the ZSL-10 APC, of which China's got 900. Again, it carries troops, it's not a tank. This is the ZD-03 Armored Infantry Fighting Vehicle Airborne, of which China currently has none. So it's had them for a while and it got rid of them over time. This is the ZBD-04 Armored Infantry Fighting Vehicle Airborne, of which China's got 2,300. This is a very large vehicle. So it might require a lot of chutes to land, and perhaps an aircraft cannot carry more than one at a time. But were China to drop onto Taiwan, this would give Chinese infantry immediate protection once they landed. This is the ZBD-05 Armored Infantry Fighting Vehicle Marine, of which China's got 900. These would debark from amphibious ships and then drive up the beaches along the coast of Taiwan, or into Aba, the Taiwanese island in the South China Sea, or on the coast of the Philippines, or onto Okinawa. This is the ZTD-05. Essentially, it's like a tank, and it has a cannon that allows it to land on the beach. Again, it carries infantry with it, and it's a more heavily weaponed version of it. So again, it can be used against Taiwan or against Japanese islands in the Kyushus, or against the Philippines. This is the WZ-523 APC, of which China no longer has any, but they were used in the far west, in places like Xinjiang, which is Tibet, or Xinjiang. We have large expanses of desert and mountain roads. Of course, there are thousands of trucks in the People's Liberation Army that do the logistics and the transportation and the whole supply network for the Chinese military. This is the HJ-9 anti-tank guided missile on a vehicle, of which China's got 450. So these would be used to support the tanks. Again, these vehicles are rather poorly armored, but they're able to make use of the terrain to protect themselves against tank attacks while firing missiles at very long range against armored vehicles of the enemy. This is a PTL-02 100mm support self-propelled anti-tank gun. So that's a gun. It's not an artillery piece. It's meant to shoot at armored vehicles. Because it's wheeled, it can go quite quickly. So in theory, it could be deployed where you've got a good road network or a flat, hard surface like a rocky desert. China's got 250 of these. This is the PTZ-89 120mm self-propelled anti-tank gun. China's got 230 of these. Again, this is not a piece of artillery. This is actually a tank gun. And this is, because it's not a tank, so it doesn't have very good armor. It's meant to make use of the terrain and to be used defensively. So if there's going to be a large number of tanks that are attacking, it's more cost effective to use this PTZ-89 than it is an equivalent Chinese tank to protect the area. Because this vehicle is lighter, it's got less armor, but it's got the same cannon. This is the Type 62 85mm light tank that was in service in the 50s and 60s, and it's no longer being deployed. This is the Type 63 85mm light tank, of which China still got 100. It's a copy of the Russian system. It's essentially a amphibious light tank that can be used for reconnaissance. So you'd have it out in front of the forces, and it moves quite quickly, so it's able to detect the enemy, radio in, and look for weak spots or gaps in the defense line, and then the rest of the army would follow them across. This is the Type 59 100mm cannon main battle tank, of which China still got 600. These are very old models, a copy of the Soviet T-55. Here you can see the Type 59 in an advance. This type of advance, which is very dense, can be very dangerous. Normally Western tanks have one pair of tanks moving while the other pair of tanks are in overwatch. So they're basically covering the movement of the first two tanks. And once the first two tanks have hit a location, then the next two tanks follow. With Soviet type armies, there generally isn't the money available for all the soldiers to be training all the time, because the engines wear out on the vehicles, and so you don't have that same fine-grained level of tactical analysis. You essentially have the entire organization moving in one formation towards a target, which is very dangerous, because while they're moving, they're not able to shoot as effectively, and so they can be destroyed. So they're less able to take advantage of terrain. If China evolves its political culture, its military culture may follow. There might be greater initiative cultivated in the leaders, and you might get that more fine-grained maneuver. But so far, China has not demonstrated that capability. This is the Type 79. It's got a 105 millimeter cannon. There's about 200 of these. It's a main battle tank, but with the 105 millimeter gun, it's sort of dated to the 1970s. This is the Type 88 125 millimeter cannon, which is the same as the Soviet version. There's 300 of these. These are more modern. It's got NBC protection, all welded hull. It's got a crew of 4. So this would be equivalent of a Soviet tank from the 1980s. This is the Type 96 125 millimeter cannon, 3-person crew. This implies a turret autoloader. It's got composite armor, turret design, thermal optics, optical jammers, and so this is the equivalent of a Soviet tank from the 1990s. China's got about 2,500 of these. China's not dramatically increased its number of tanks in the last 10 years. It's mostly been focusing on warships and amphibious capabilities and helicopters. And it's been incrementally increasing some of its aircraft. But the tank forces are pretty much constant, and the older versions are being put out of service. Here's a Type 99 with a 125 millimeter gun, 3 crew, composite. China's got about 1,200 of these. This is their top tank. This is the inside of the export version. This is the commander's position inside the Type 99. This is the driver's position in the Type 79. And the gunner's position. These are the different rounds, the 125, 100, and 105 millimeter armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot. So what you've got is a tungsten core, and that you've got in the back there a sleeve which falls off, which releases that thin, long arrow and hands over to it additional kinetic power, which then smashes through the armor. This is the autoloader in the Type 99. Very controversial, obviously, because it implies the ammunition is inside the turret, and if the turret's hit, as we saw with Russian tanks in Ukraine, the whole tank goes up in a flaming explosion. This is the ZTQ-15 light tank, of which China's got about 400. They're not so light. They're between 30 and 40 tons. So it's a matter of their ability to navigate bridges. I suspect this tank, which has been around since 2017, is being designed to fit within the amphibious craft that would land on Taiwan, the Japanese Kyushu Islands, or on the Philippine island of Luzon. This is the ZTL-11 assault gun. Again, that's a cannon that's used to hit targets. China's got about 1,000 of these, very mobile. So into artillery, China's got, of 2,800, some of it is the Type 83 122 millimeter artillery. Again, this is a Soviet caliber because these weapons were inherited from the Soviet Union. This is the Type 96, same caliber, 122 millimeter. This is a copy of the Soviet D-30, which is the most common Soviet towed artillery piece, and it's a good quality artillery piece. This is the Type 66, which is a copy of the Soviet D-20. 152 millimeter gun. The problem with all of these towed types of artillery is when the shell is fired, the other side, the targeting side typically has radar, like NATO. They've got a radar. They detect where the shell is coming from, and then they can do counter battery in about a minute. So you've got to shoot, and then you've got to move very quickly before counter battery comes in and destroys the artillery. So you want self-propelled artillery. In other words, you want an armored vehicle with the cannon inside it so that the crew is protected from fragments. So there's a group of these, a quantity of these artillery pieces out of 1,600 in the inventory of 152 millimeter. This is the Type 66 firing. This is the Type 59, which is the Soviet M46 130 millimeter artillery. China's got 234. This is heavy artillery. Here you can see it being towed by a truck, again, which is not ideal. Here's the Type 83 152 millimeter howitzer. China's got some of these. Howitzers, as opposed to guns, are designed to have a rounder trajectory, so they can fly high in the air and then come down on the other side of a mountain or a hill. This is the Type 85 155 millimeter. China's got some of these. These look like they're copies of the 777 or other easily mobile artillery pieces that can be carried around by aircraft to remote parts of China. This is the WAC-21 155 millimeter artillery piece, of which China's got 150. You can see the vehicle there allows it to become self-propelled. In other words, you just de-lock the legs at the back, you pop out the wheel, and this thing can drive down the road. So this is some of China's earliest self-propelled artillery. This is a Type 70-1 122 millimeter self-propelled howitzer. China no longer has any of these. This is the PLZ-89 122 millimeter, the same gun you saw before. These are self-propelled. China's got 500 of these, and 200 are in store. So these are being phased out gradually. These are the PLZ-07 122 millimeter. Again, the same gun. They're self-propelled, and China's got about 700 of these. This is the PCL-09 122 millimeter self-propelled artillery piece. China's got about 300 of these. Again, useful for parts of China where you've got hard surfaces like some of the desert areas in the northwest. Here's the PCL-09 122 millimeter, of which China's got 300 with the gun deployed. Here's the PCL-161, same artillery piece. There are about 30 of these. This is the PCL-171, 122 millimeter. You can see it's a very small vehicle, and there are about 60 of these. These are probably air portable. This is the PLZ-83 152 millimeter self-propelled gun. China's got about 150 of these and 200 in store. This is, again, it's a copy of a Soviet model, and it's old technology, so it's being phased out. This is the PLZ-05 155 millimeter self-propelled gun. China's got about 320 of these. 155 millimeter is pretty much the standard model for an artillery piece that fires out to about 20 kilometers. There are a whole number of support vehicles, particularly for the artillery. This is the PLZ-45 ammunition vehicle. So there are many different varieties of these types of vehicles that can very quickly provide changes of equipment to the gun and resupply. It basically moves its back end into the artillery self-propelled gun, and then they would exchange artillery on a ramp. So here we can see that being done. So one of the things it can fire is the PL6 152 millimeter laser-guided anti-tank shell. It's a Russian copy, basically coming out of an inspiration in the 1970s, the American Copperhead, which is now, of course, a much more diversified system. It's a laser-guided anti-tank rocket that's being fired by artillery, and when it comes over the battlefield, it's picked up. It picks up the laser and hits the target. And NATO and the U.S. has been working on this since the 1970s. This is the Type 63 multiple rocket launcher. China has many of these, and they've exported it all over the world. They're probably no longer in use in the Chinese inventory. This is the Type 81 122 millimeter self-propelled multiple rocket launcher out of a total of 1,250. So China's got a lot of these systems, which again, it's a copy of the Soviet system. You can put a lot of rocket firepower onto a single location. It's not very accurate. You've got good range. It does take a long time to resupply the rockets. This is the PHZ 122 millimeter multiple rocket launcher. China's got 393 of these. This is the PHL-03 Type 03 300 millimeter multiple launch rocket system with a range of 90 kilometers, which is not quite far enough for China to strike Taiwan. China's got 175 of these. This is the P-12 short-range ballistic missile, of which China's got a few. This is the People Liberation Army self-propelled MLRS concept way back in 2012. It's a decade ago, and they're still working on the model. This is the Type 73 armored recovery vehicle. Again, a great number of these types of vehicles that are meant to do engineering work and to help repair tanks in the field and help to pick up tanks on the battlefield that have been damaged, pull them back, and start undergoing repairs so they can be put back into the line. In sort of a conservative estimate, you could probably repair on a 24-hour basis about 10% of all the tanks that are destroyed. And depending on how good the technical crews are, many of the tanks that are hit on the battlefield can actually be recovered and repaired, which is why a large part of the military's logistics branch are tow vehicles picking up damaged armored vehicles for repair. This is a Type 59 armored vehicle bridge. And you can see here it's got a fold-out bridge that you would put over a gap. This is not really a gap we're looking at here, but this is essentially how you would deploy the bridge. Here's a military engineer pontoon bridge. China's got a lot of engineering. The Soviets had more engineering because in order for them to invade into Western Europe, there were a great many rivers like the Rhine that they would have to cross. So they had a lot of bridging that could be deployed very, very quickly. China has similar capabilities, but it's very likely China's engineering currently is focused on conducting an amphibious attack on Taiwan. China is heavily dependent on its rail network to move armored vehicles around. This is typical of most countries. Moving an armored vehicle down a cement road will severely damage its tracks over time. It's much more efficient to move armored vehicles on a train. So here we can see air defense guns. This is a Type 59 100mm air defense gun, of which there are 7,000. It's today generally not a very useful system. Most aircraft will fire their ordnance at ranges way beyond what these cannons can target. Helicopters are the likely target of these, but these don't have the mobility in order to deploy where helicopters are going to show up. Nor are they useful for shooting down cruise missiles or the ordnance that's coming close by. So these are just generally not very useful systems. Here's a 25mm air defense self-propelled system, of which China's got 270. Here you got a radar with 4 guns. Here's a Type 07 35mm air defense system, of which China's got 120. Here's the Type 88 37mm air defense system, of which China's got 6. It's basically a copy of the Russian system, and it should be phased out. This is the Type 80 57mm. On a tank chassis, of which China no longer has any. This is the SK-331 Russian Tor-1, or the Soviet SA-15 system, which China got from Russia. China operates 24 of these. This is the HQ-60 SAM system, of which China's got 30. This is the HQ-7A, which is a Chinese copy of the French Crotal system, of which China's got about 200 in operation. This is the HQ-16A SAM system, of which China's got about 200. This is the HQ-17 SAM system, of which China's got about 20. These are some of the rockets that China's had used in the past: the HQ-2, HQ-9, 5V, 5IR, the 48N6E, and the HQ-12. This is the Z-9 light helicopter, of which China's got about 20 total. This is the WZ attack helicopter. Now, China used to have a very small number. Now they put a major effort into building up helicopters, so they would have at least a number comparable to what the Russians or the NATO countries have. Combat helicopters are a useful addition to the armored infantry artillery triad because they add flexibility. They allow you to move into a location very quickly and put down a lot of anti-tank rockets. And to cover flanks and to do reconnaissance and to designate targets for copperhead artillery rounds that can then come in and destroy tanks. These are the WZ-19 light attack helicopters, of which China's got 120, and they're building these up reasonably quickly with about 20 aircraft manufactured per year. This is the Blue Sword LJ-7 helicopter anti-tank guided missile with a 2,000 meter range, used to destroy armored vehicles. China's got 19 Black Hawks, and they've got 900 other assorted helicopters in the different branches. I didn't elaborate on all of these. Most of these are utility or transport helicopters of a variety: casualty evacuation, scouting, and a whole bunch of transport helicopters. So drones, this is the CH-4B unmanned aerial vehicle, of which China's got 4. This is the BZK-005 UAV. We don't know how many of these there are. The BZK-006 unmanned aerial vehicle, BZK-007 unmanned aerial vehicle. I'm thinking this is a concept system. The BZK-008 unmanned aerial vehicle. This is the loitering munition, the Harpy, which comes from Israel. When Israel sold it to China, there's a bit of an issue with the U.S. government over the sale, which the U.S. government thought Israel should not have done. This is the Hongdu Stealth unmanned aerial vehicle. It's unknown if China's built more than this model. China's got about 2,000 assorted training aircraft. This is the L-15, which China no longer operates. There's a variety of different systems. They could be used in combat, but they're really meant for training. They don't have the range. They certainly don't have the payload or the sensor suite or the communication suite, and they're not stealthy. They're essentially meant to train people, but countries in the developing world very often will use these countries in combat because of a shortage of funds. So China's aircraft. We see a large number of aircraft being retired of the older variety. China used to have the largest air force in the world at one point, even larger than the United States, with 4,000 aircraft, almost none of which had radar and can only operate in the daytime and in good weather. That air force is virtually gone. These aircraft here are the last types of those aircraft. The Chengdu J-7s, they have a sufficient radius to fly to and around Taiwan, and it's about 340 of these, and that's a huge drop from the large number of these aircraft that were exported. The Xi'an JH-7 fighter ground attack, 1,700 kilometer radius. There's about 260 of these. This is the Shenyang J-8. There's a 1,000 kilometer radius. These are, again, very old aircraft that are down to 74. They're clearly being phased out. The Q-5 Fantan fighter ground attack was originally thought to be a nuclear bomber. No longer are they in operation. This is the J-10 fighter. It's originally thought to be the Lavi aircraft that Israel was developing. When the Americans cut funding, Israel then sold the technology to China, and again, it was another security scandal between the U.S. and Israel's attempt to sell to the Chinese market. This also affected the Israeli attempt to sell airborne early warning aircraft to China, which the U.S. had Israel redirect towards India. So there are about 548 of these Israeli-designed or Israeli-design-inspired aircraft in China. They're essentially inexpensive light combat aircraft. Sukhoi 27, China bought a number of these aircraft from Russia and reverse engineered them to produce their own aircraft. China, however, has been phasing these out, and they've only got 32 of these left. These are the J-11, which are the Chinese versions of the Sukhoi 27, and China operates 297 of these, which is about what they've been operating the last 15 years. This is the Sukhoi 30, of which, again, China bought 97 of them from Russia, and then they supplemented it with their own designs. This is the J-16, of which they have 170, which is based on the Soviet Sukhoi 30 design. Again, the Russians, to some extent, regret selling the technology to China because China reverse engineered and then built their own. This is the Sukhoi 35, of which China's got 24. And these are very, very large aircraft. If you compare them to a MiG-29, they're much larger. This is the Chengdu J-20, which is China's main stealth aircraft. These aircraft really have a single purpose, which is to attack the airborne early warning aircraft and the tanker aircraft used by China's adversaries, which is basically the U.S. These aircraft have limited stealth capability, but from the front, they're fairly stealthy. And so they have one purpose, which is to move in very, very quickly, take out the command and control aircraft, and then the other aircraft are not going to be able to function as well. This is a J-31 stealth aircraft. There are 3 prototypes, although it's currently not known if there are any. China has a large variety of these H-6 bombers. These are essentially Tupolev 16 Badgers from the 1950s, which China has continuously upgraded. And it's thought that China is working on a stealth wing bomber like the B-2 bomber, but it's currently not yet deployed. So there's 221 of these H-6 bombers, which serve a variety of different bomber functions, both in support of the Navy and nuclear bombers, and in support of attacks on ground targets where they would launch cruise missiles. Here you can see a lineup of the H-6 bombers. Here's an H-6U tanker, of which China's got about 10. This is the KJ-2000 AWACS, of which China's got 4. China's had about 4 of these, for the last 10 years. These provide airborne early warning. They help coordinate the missions of Chinese aircraft. These are important if China is operating significantly distanced from its own shore, because within China itself it has its own radar system, so it can do interceptions coordinated from the ground. Here's the KJ-2000. It can detect up to 60 targets at the same time, and it can detect low targets flying perhaps 300 feet off the ground at a range of 470 kilometers, and higher targets at 600 kilometers. This is where most of the KJ-200s are based, in Wuxi Air Force Base in Zhejiang. This is the KJ-200 AWACS, of which China's got 4. This is the ZDK-03 AWACS, which were exported to Pakistan from China to counterbalance the Israeli export of the Falcon to India. These are very important aircraft, because without these, aircraft are essentially flying around using the radar in their nose, and those radars are far weaker than these radars, which allow the aircraft that are flying to be rationally distributed and to maximize their use, so you can direct them efficiently towards what they're supposed to be intercepting. This is the JF-17. It's an export aircraft from China to Pakistan, and Pakistan purchased 150 of these. China has a large number of electronic intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft. This is just a variety of an example of one. China's got 4 of the Tupolev 154MD electronic intelligence aircraft. China makes use of a large number of transports. The largest group of transports that China has that it bought from abroad is the Ilyushin 76, very, very common Soviet model that's used all across the world. China's got about 20 of these heavy transport aircraft. These could be used for transport as well as dropping paratroops. China's got an equivalent of the American Boeing 17. It's the Y-20 heavy transport, 31 of these. There were requests to have up to 100 and something of these, which would essentially allow China to have a force as big as the U.S. and would enable China to fly airborne troops across the planet in much the same way as the U.S. would with the 82nd Airborne. So, coastal defense. This is the CJ-10, Donghai-10 anti-ship cruise missile. It's got a range of 1,600 kilometers and a speed of Mach 2.5. It's a very old system. The Soviets operated a similar system in the 1950s off of their coast, and so the threat of coastal systems to blue navies has been constant in terms of missile threats from the 1950s. There's nothing particularly new there. This is the CJ-10 anti-ship cruise missile on a tractor erector launcher, so you can sort of drive up and down the coast with these things. You do have to recall that the Argentinians fired a shore-based Exocet missile that hit the logistical landing ship Galahad and killed a number of British soldiers that were conducting a landing. So coastal missiles are useful. This is a CJ-10 anti-ship cruise missile launch. It's a range of 1,600 kilometers. So this is the Hainan anti-submarine warfare craft. China's still got 30 of these. They're virtually useless. They have an active sonar and they can drop depth charges. They're essentially just patrol aircraft. It is amazing that they're still operating. It's likely they're being used for just general patrolling. This is the Haiqing anti-submarine warfare ship. There's 18 of these. These are more sophisticated in their ability to track submarines. This is the Wochi mine countermeasures vessel. China's got a lot of ports. They're vulnerable to being mined aerially or by submarines in a conflict with a Western power, and so they need to be able to clear the mines in order to get their ships to move in and out of harbor. This is the Wolei mine layer, of which China's got one, so they could lay mines. Why they would do that is not entirely clear. They might, if they were to capture Taiwan, they could then lay mines in the locations where they would expect the U.S. to be able to conduct a landing. This is the Huang Fen fast attack craft. It's got 4 HY-2 anti-ship missiles with a range of 104 kilometers. These are no longer in use. They're like the Osa or Nanuchka class Soviet-era boats. They're basically old style. They're not seaworthy, so you can't really keep them in the out in the blue waters for long. They're basically meant for coastal, and if the weather's really bad, they come in. And their radar suites are very poor, and they have virtually no air defense. This is the Hujian fast attack craft. It's got 6 YJ-8 anti-ship missiles, range of 45 kilometers. Again, it's a coastal patrol craft. China's got 6 of these. China's got 18 Hushin fast attack craft with 4 YJ-1 45-kilometer range anti-ship missiles. China's got 60 of the Hubei fast attack craft. They're armed with 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles with a range of 270 kilometers. But again, it's heavily dependent on, is there a target at that range, and are they able to detect a target out that far? And it's very unlikely with their radar suite they're able to do that. They would need assistance from aircraft or other means of remote detection. This is the Jiangdao corvette, of which China has built a lot recently. They've built dozens almost every year. They're up to 72 now. Each of them carries 4 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles to a range of 270 kilometers. And so this is the basically equivalent of a light frigate meant to patrol the shores. It can go into the deep into the ocean. It's seaworthy, and it's got a more sophisticated sensor suite. This is the Y-8J Naval airborne early warning and command aircraft. So it uses a radar in its nose. It's able to detect aircraft and ships, and is able to provide coordination. China's Navy's got 4 of these. This is the Y-8W Naval AWACS. China's got 6 of these. Again, the radar's on the top, and it provides coordination for the different services over great distances. This is very important to detect enemy ships because satellites can be spoofed, they can be blocked by weather and clouds. Maritime aircraft can be shot down. This thing, if it flies very, very high, it's got good coverage with its radar and can see quite far, and it can identify ships from far away. This is the KQ-200 maritime reconnaissance anti-submarine warfare aircraft. You can see the long tail at the back. That's the magnetic anomaly detector. It can detect metal immediately beneath the aircraft. So it overflies a submarine at a depth of 200 or 300 meters. The ship's metal will distort the magnetic field, and this aircraft will pick it up and immediately begin procedures to prosecute that ship. China's big weakness vis-a-vis the U.S. is its anti-submarine warfare technology. China's concerned that if it goes into the Pacific Ocean, U.S. submarines will be able to sink the Chinese aircraft carriers, and China will not be able to stop the American submarines. And so that's the main weakness in China's military that they're trying to address. And this aircraft was developed in just the last 6 years and built to a number of 20. This is the KJ-200 Moth airborne early warning aircraft, of which there are 6. Here's the KJ-500 airborne early warning aircraft, of which there are 14. So all of these are in service of the Navy. So you can see the Navy's putting a lot of priority in being aware about the local surroundings. This is probably going to be supplemented with long-range drones. But you know, the problem with drones is they're not going to be able to carry a radar of the size that you see on this aircraft, so they're basically going to have much shorter reach, and they're likely therefore to be intercepted. Again, this is the H-6DU tanker. There are 10 in the Air Force. There are 5 in the Navy. So one thing that China has a great shortage of, and this has been a problem going on since the 1990s, for the last quarter century, is that China does not have a lot of tankers, which means its aircraft cannot reach very far beyond China's shore. And this is a problem because if the U.S. has aircraft firing very standoff missiles, China's just not going to be able to get out there to jump the American aircraft before they drop their payload. And this is a ground effects vehicle, which is a physical phenomenon of aircraft flying very, very close to the water. It can fly at very high speeds, and because it's flying so low, it's very difficult to detect with radar, because the electromagnetic interference caused by the water essentially hides the aircraft. It can't go at the speed of an aircraft, but it can go a lot faster than a normal boat, and the wingspan can be much shorter. This is a Soviet Ka-31 airborne early warning helicopter, which China was working with early on before they had aircraft carriers and the capability to have airborne early warning aircraft on those aircraft carriers. China's currently got 9 of these. This is the Ka-28 Helix anti-submarine warfare helicopter, again from the Soviet era, which China's been using. And it's obviously China is very concerned about the U.S. submarine force, and they've currently got 14. This is a concept of a V-22 Osprey clone prototype, which China's been working on, and it probably has one working somewhere. The V-22 Osprey's been out for quite some time. So this is a naval torpedo. It's the Chinese copy of the Mark 46 and the Mark 50, which is a standard NATO American anti-submarine torpedo, 324 millimeters. So this is the Jiangkai frigate, which fires the YJ-83 anti-ship missile to a range of 270 kilometers. China's currently got 32 of these, and they've been building a lot of these. These are very useful for escort missions of convoys, anti-submarine warfare, some air defense, and anti-ship capability. So these are the workhorse ships. They're the ships that are the most common in the Chinese fleet, and China's been building a handful every single year. So this is probably the ship that's been the most built. This is the Jiangwei FFG. It has 8 YJ-83 270 kilometer range anti-ship missiles. China's got 8. This is the Jianghu FFG. China's got 5 of these. They fire the SY-1A anti-ship missile with a range of 50 kilometers. These are old ships and they're being phased out. This is the Luda frigate. It's no longer in service, but it was 5 years ago. This is the Luhai destroyer. It has a YJ-82 anti-ship missile with a range of 130 kilometers. China built one, so it was probably a concept ship, and they didn't build any others. This is the Luhu destroyer. It has 16 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles to a range of 270 kilometers. This is the Luoyang destroyer. It has 16 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles to a range of 270 kilometers range. China's got 2 of these. This is the Luoyang 2 destroyer. It's got 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, and it's got a range of 270 kilometers. China's got 6 of these. Now, this is the Luoyang 3 destroyer. This is the second most built ship in the last 10 years in the Chinese Navy. It's got 8 YJ-18A anti-ship missiles to a range of 270 kilometers. This is meant to contribute as an escort to the Chinese aircraft carriers and the Chinese cruisers, as well as providing protection to an amphibious force. So it's a good all-round modern technology destroyer. This is the YJ-18, again, which has been developed just in the last 10 years. It's an anti-ship missile with a range of 540 kilometers. It can achieve a speed of Mach 3 terminally, although when it's flying towards the target, it's subsonic, and it has a 300-kilogram warhead. This is the Luzhou destroyer. It's got 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles to a range of 270 kilometers. China's got 2 of these. This is the SY-1A, CSS-N1 Scrubrush anti-ship missile. It's the old Soviet Styx. It had a range of 50 kilometers and it flew at Mach 1. This was on the frigate I showed you earlier that is no longer in service. This is the HY-2 CSSC 3D Seersucker anti-ship missile, range of 104 kilometers. I saw one of these in Indonesia in the military museum at the back. They had one just sitting around, not on display, and I managed to finagle my way and take a look at it. This is the YJ-8 CSSN-4 Sardine anti-ship cruise missile with a range of 45 kilometers. This is the YJ-62, which is the C-602 anti-ship cruise missile with a range of 400 kilometers. This is the YJ-82 C-802H Shakad anti-ship cruise missile with a range of 130 kilometers. It's essentially a clone of the Harpoon missile, which is the American and American allied NATO standard for anti-ship missiles. This is the YJ-83 C-803 CSSN-8 Saccade anti-ship missile. You can see it lined up, the range of 270 kilometers and speed of Mach 2. So we're getting here into the Soviet systems and the Russian systems that China bought. This is the S-17 anti-ship 17 Krypton or air-to-surface Krypton KH-31A anti-ship missile, range of 55 kilometers and Mach 3. This is the P-270 Musket SSN-2 Sunburn anti-ship missile with a range of 130 kilometers and a speed of Mach 3. This is fired off of the Hangzhou ships, which are basically the Submarine class ships that Russia sold to China. This is a 3M-82 Musket Sunburn modified anti-ship missile with a range of 240 kilometers. This is a 3M-54 Club anti-ship missile SSN-27. It's got a range of 300 kilometers and a Mach 2.5. It's launched from the Kilo submarines that China has, which they purchased from the Soviet Union and Russia. These submarines are very, very quiet, diesel-electric submarines. This is the Fuqing. There are two of these. China's got 205 logistics ships of comparable size. You can imagine having to keep a fleet supplied at sea requires a lot of utility vessels, some for logistics, firefighting, for reloading of missiles, a complicated variety of medical ships. And these are not going to be listed. This is at-sea replenishment between a supply ship and a Chinese surface vessel. Here we've got the Hangzhou destroyers. They carry the 8 Musket anti-ship missiles to a range of 130 kilometers, and the other one carries the range to 240 kilometers. China's got 2 of each. These are basically the Submarine class destroyers from the old Soviet fleet. These used to be the most powerful ships in China's arsenal until they came out with their new cruisers, which are more modern and have a lot larger vertical launch systems. So this is the new cruiser. It's the equivalent of the U.S. Ticonderoga with its Aegis system. It's an 11,000-ton ship. China doesn't classify it as a cruiser, but the U.S. does, the Type 055 Renhai, and it has a YJ-18A missile. What's important is it's launching it from a vertical launch system where you've got multiple rockets that are targeted vertically, and you can load it with different kinds of systems depending on the tactical situation. And so this is a modern configuration, and it's the most modern warship surface combat ship that China has, and they currently have 3 of these. These would be used to provide air defense missiles to protect the aircraft carriers and the amphibious ships when they're conducting their landing. This is China's first aircraft carrier, the CV-16 Liaoning. It went to sea in 2016. It started in 1985 as in the Soviet Union as the Kiev class. It's of 70,000 tons. It carries 24 J-15 aircraft and 17 helicopters. It's China's first aircraft carrier, and it was started out as an aircraft carrier for training, and then China decided to rebuild it and make it operational. These are the aircraft that operate off the deck of the aircraft carrier, the J-15 Flying Shark carrier aircraft that are basically versions of the Sukhoi 27. The CV-16 Liaoning is obviously important for the Chinese people. It makes them feel proud of the technology and the power of their state. The problem is that these aircraft carriers can only really operate if they're provided an escort, which includes protection against air attack and submarines. And it's not clear that China's able to do that. In the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, it's very likely the aircraft carriers will be sent out sacrificed in order to buy time by blocking American resupplies to Taiwan, and it's very likely these aircraft carriers will not survive very long. Alternately, China might want to keep a fleet in being by keeping them close to shore and acting as a constant threat and keeping the U.S. fleet distracted. China's second aircraft carrier was built in China. It was deployed in 2019. It's a 70,000-ton copy of the Kiev class. It has 32 J-15 aircraft and 12 helicopters. China's third aircraft carrier, the Fujian CV-18, was launched in 2022. It's an 80,000-ton aircraft carrier. It's still undergoing trials. It's got 40 aircraft, including an airborne early warning system. So, all of these ships are meant to contribute to an amphibious effort on Taiwan. That's China's current strategic build-up focus. Here you can see an amphibious reloading of a ship on a beach. This is in particular the PLZ-07 122mm self-propelled howitzer amphibious tank. So to enable an amphibious operation, China's built very quickly, and this is again all in the last 5 years, 8 Type 071 Yuzhou LPDs. These are 25,000-ton amphibious craft, each carrying a reinforced battalion consisting of 800 troops, 16 armored fighting vehicles, and 28 helicopters. 9 of these together would be the equivalent of a division of soldiers, although without the logistics grouping. That's a fair bit of landing force. So this is a large component of China's amphibious force that would attack Taiwan. And you can see in the bay it carries 60 tanks and other armored vehicles that would be able to deploy if the seas are not too rough. This is the back access that would be flooded in the event of an amphibious attack, and then the vehicles in the back would then float out towards their beach. This is the terrain when it's not flooded, inside the vehicle, the rear garage. The Type 071 LPD also has an LCAC, which is a hovercraft. The Type 726 LCAC is seen here, and it can carry vehicles and personnel. Here's the Zuber LCAC, which is made in Ukraine, which is much larger and can be used for amphibious landings on a beach. The beauty of these vehicles is their pressure per square foot is low enough that they can actually float over a minefield. And so they don't actually have to land on the subsurface. They can float on the water and then go up the beach. Here's the Zuber LCAC undergoing movement. So the newest ship, which is much larger than the earlier LPD, is the Type 075 Yushen LHD. It's 40,000 tons. It carries 800 troops, 60 armored fighting vehicles, as well as 28 helicopters. So it looks like a little miniature aircraft carrier. So it's very similar to the equivalent class in the U.S. fleet, where the Americans have got about 10 of these. China's built their first. So China's equipping itself with an equivalent force as the U.S. Navy's ability to land U.S. Marines. Now there are a number of a wide variety of vehicles that are used to land vehicles on a beach that are a much smaller size. Here's a UCAN LST landing ship tank. It can carry 10 tanks or 200 troops, and China's got 4 of these. And you can see on the extreme left, the nose opens on the beach, and the vehicles can ride out on the nose. This is the U-Hai landing ship, and it can. China's got about 10 of these. This is the U-Ting landing ship tank. It has the capacity for 10 tanks and 250 troops, and you can see at the back it can also accommodate helicopters. Here you can see the U-Ting undergoing reloading of its bay with armored vehicles. This is the U-Deng LSM, of which China's got 1. Here's the U-Bay, of which China's got 11. This is sort of like a ferry type of system. And there's an assorted collection of 255 landing craft that would operate alongside those LPDs, the LHDs, and the landing craft, the LSMs. Here you can see Yunnan LCUs landing on a beach. China's got 56 of these vessels. So into submarines. China actually doesn't have that many submarines. The Soviet Union at its height had over 300 submarines that they could flood into the Atlantic to interfere with commercial shipping. China and the US both have about 60 submarines, which is an equivalent force. And this puts China at a weakness because although their ally North Korea has a large number of submarines, they tend to be small, China has to also deal with Japan and Australia's submarine force. So here you've got an old diesel systems. You've got the Ming SSKs. China's got 4 still in operation and 10 were put into store. So these are very likely used for training. China's got 12 Song diesel submarines. They carry 2 YJ-8 anti-ship missiles to a range of 45 kilometers. So these things would get information on the location of a convoy and then would fire off these missiles from underwater. Here's 18 UN SSK. China's built quite a few of these, about the rate of 1 a year over the last decade. And they fire the Club missile, which is a Russian missile that has a range of 300 kilometers. Now these are Russian submarines, designed submarines. They're very quiet, and they fire 2 Club anti-ship missiles each to a range of 300 kilometers. China's got 12 of these. Here you can see the Kilo out of the water on board a utility ship. China's got 6 nuclear submarines, and these submarines are important because they have great range. So they can go off into the mid-Pacific, assuming they're not detected and chased, because they're not quite as quiet as US submarines. China's got 3 Han SSN, which are currently in store. These submarines were obviously very loud nuclear submarines, and China built them as a test bed, and they're being replaced. China's standard torpedo is the 533 millimeter Yu-6. It's the copy of the American Mark 48, and which is a very common torpedo of America and those countries that buy the similar system, like the British. So here's a sort of a reliability, relative detectability over time. And you can see that the Chinese submarines are getting quieter over time, significantly, but they still have a very long way to go. This is a Gulf SSG, which was a test bed for missile launches. So China had this in its inventory until quite recently, and now they no longer have it in use. So China needed to put its missiles in the ocean because the missiles that were deployed in China were too easily destroyed by a first strike. And so this was the first system. It was never operational, meaning it never did operational patrols, and it carried 12 missiles, and it was eventually pulled out of action, the Zia ballistic missile submarine. China currently has 6 Jin ballistic missile submarines. England and France each have 4 of their own ballistic missile submarines. So China's trying to get closer to the number that the Americans have, although it probably won't go as far as how many the Russians have. There are currently 2 additional under construction, so we expect China would have about 8 of these by about 2025. And they haven't yet been on patrol in the Pacific. They're very loud. China would very much like to take control of the southern part of the South China Sea, where it's deep enough for these to deploy. These cannot deploy off the coast of China because the waters there are 200 to 300 meters deep, which means these submarines would be visible from the air. They need to go into deeper waters. The problem is China's surrounded by the Kyushu Islands, Taiwan, and disputes in the South China Sea, and so the submarines have nowhere to go. It is possible that the Chinese could get access to the Sea of Okhotsk, which is where the Russians currently keep their ballistic missile submarines. It's territorial waters behind the Kuril Islands in the Russian Far East. So China's looking strategically for a place to put these submarines. If these go into the Pacific, they're loud enough that the Americans can follow them, and they'd be passing by microphones on most of the islands that separate China from the Pacific. Here you can see the Jin class at Sanya Naval Base on Hainan Island, north of the South China Sea. This is just off the coast of Vietnam. The JL-1 was on the Zia ballistic missile submarine, and you can see here the JL-2, approximate size, and it would have been deployed. It is currently deployed on the Jin. The Jin cannot cannot reach the United States from the South China Sea. It has to deploy out farther in order to strike at the U.S. This is the Sea-Launched Ballistic Missile Carrier. It carries the missiles and is able to bring the missiles to the ballistic missile submarines wherever they are, currently in Hainan. This is the Yuan satellite tracking ship, of which China has 5. China deploys these ships to observe the ballistic missile launches of other countries. China used one of these ships, which had become damaged in a collision, in order to test its anti-aircraft carrier missile system. So this is the DF-21D, anti-ship ballistic missile, tractor erector launcher. China has 6 missiles for one of these launchers, and it fired one of these at that ship I just showed you, and it struck it and sank it. And this was a confirmation of the viability of using a ballistic missile guided by satellites and sensors to destroy aircraft carriers. This is the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile. China, before it struck the ship, built a scale cement model in the desert to test the DF-21D, and you can see that there was a successful strike at 2 different locations on the equivalent shape of an aircraft carrier. So in 2011, the Yuan Wang 4 was hit by a DF-21D. This is the Yuan Wang 4 here. So you can see how far out the 21D reaches. It reaches all the way out past Indonesia. There's a question as to how accurate it is. It should be pointed out that aircraft carriers were never intended to operate off of the coast of a peer competitor. Aircraft carriers are meant for the deep ocean, where in the absence of land-based aircraft, they are supreme. But land-based aircraft and land bases are always much safer, cheaper, and stronger than an aircraft carrier. So putting an aircraft carrier against even a simple air base on a coast is a misuse of its resources. Aircraft carriers are meant to win the wars at sea. Only against a very small, weak country can they be used directly against the coast of that country. So, conventional missiles. China's developed a lot of conventional missiles because it had less faith in the ability of its air force to penetrate enemy air defenses. And so it built a lot of these rockets to strike at Taiwan and at American bases at Okinawa, Guam, Japanese bases on Kyushu, and potential American bases in the Philippines. So the DF-16 intermediate range ballistic missile, which is the Chinese SS-11, has a range of 800 to 1,000 kilometers. China's got a total of 36 of these. So these would deploy from their bases and then fire their rockets at air bases, at barracks, and radar facilities within Taiwan. This is the DF-11 short-range ballistic missile, tractor erector launcher, M9, the CSS-7. It's got a range of 700 kilometers. Again, conventional warhead. It could fire cluster munitions, so it has a lot of little bomblets. It could come down on an airport and crack the taxiway or the main runway to delay aircraft leaving. It could come in on an airbase, and its warhead can track revetments where the aircraft are being kept in hardened shelters and destroy those. Here's the DF-11. China's got 108 launchers and 600 missiles, and all of these are deployed in provinces that are within range of Taiwan. This is the DF-11A brigade of 24 launchers. Here again, you can see an emergency, basically occupation of the vehicles and their deployment. This is a DF-15 short-range ballistic missile, the M11, NATO CSS-6 solid fuel rocket. It's got a range of 600 meters. China's got 81 launchers and 350 missiles, and these can be equipped with a nuclear warhead of basically half a megaton, which is a city destroyer. So these can be used to strike targets on Guam, in Kyushu, basically off the coast of China in the event of a nuclear escalation. Here's a DF-15 launch. Here's a DF-15 short-range ballistic missile brigade. Here you can see some of the early missiles. You can see the DF-1, which is basically a Chinese V-2 that the Russians provided China, the SS-2. There's the DF-2, the DF-3, the DF-4. Now the DF-5, ultimately the CSS-4, was the first ICBM aimed by China at the U.S., paradoxically when China and the U.S. were becoming allies in the late 1970s, early 1980s. China at that time operated the 2nd Artillery, which was the military organization responsible for operating the ballistic missiles aimed at the Soviet Union and the U.S. These are the different bases for missiles located in China. China is undergoing a large construction of 300 silos. Not entirely clear what the logic is. China's got as much highway kilometerage as the U.S., but the Chinese may be concerned that against satellite surveillance, China's highway missile systems are not reliable. China's ballistic missile submarines do not have a safe deployment area in the South China Sea, and so the silo system might be seen as an alternative to provide some limited second strike. China's bombers at the moment cannot reach the U.S., although they're hoping the development of hypersonic missiles will be able to. This is the DF-2 intermediate range ballistic missile, NATO classification CSS-1, no longer in use. This is the DF-3 IRBM, NATO CSS-2. It's a liquid fuel rocket with a range of 2,500 kilometers. China sold these to Saudi Arabia, primarily for money in the 1980s. These are no longer in use with China. This is the DF-4, a range of 7,000 kilometers. China's got 10 of these still in operation. Their target is Moscow and Guam. They're liquid fuel, which means they have to be fueled up before launched, and that fueling is visible, and it basically gives enough time for Russia or America to fire a nuclear weapon before these are launched. So they're not a very efficient system. They carry 3 warheads, so they're MIRVed, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, but they're launched from fixed sites. Not a very useful system, although they're still kept around. This is the DF-5 ICBM, range of 12,000 kilometers, the NATO CSS-4. It carries 6 warheads, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, each of 4 to 5 megatons. It's not a very accurate missile, which is why the warheads are so large. It's obviously intended to strike the U.S. and became operational in 1982. It takes 2 hours to fill this with the liquid fuel that it needs, which makes it easy to destroy. It's got a circular error probability of 1,000 meters. In other words, 50% of the time it'll land within 1,000 meters of the target. The other 50% of the time it can land quite far away, several kilometers, even several hundreds of kilometers away when it misses. It must be launched from a fixed site, and there's 20 in total. Some say 18. Not a lot. So here we get into the solid fuel rockets. The advantage of a solid fuel is you press the button and the rocket launches 5 seconds later. So it's much easier and faster to deploy. This is the DF-31 mobile ICBM, the NATO CSS-10. China's got 8 of these, and these can reach the U.S. This is the DF-31 missile solid fuel system, 11,000 kilometer range with a MIRV. Each warhead is 50 kilotons. And here you can see the DF-31, the top stage. This is the DF-31A ICBM, NATO CSS-10 Mod 2, of which China's got 54. This is the DF-31, the second stage of the rocket, obviously undergoing some sort of testing. Here's the DF-41 CHSS-20, of which China's got 24. This is China's latest ICBM. It's got a range of 13,000 kilometers. It's meant to target the U.S., so you're looking at a MIRV of 10. Each missile has 10 warheads, and so that's a total of 240 targets with a circular error probability of 100 meters. So it's a very accurate missile, and it would obviously be targeting the top 240 cities and military bases in the U.S. in a single strike. And because they're mobile, they would be dispersed at different sites, hidden in barns and various other camouflage facilities, and they would drive out to a field, and within a few minutes they would launch the rocket. So these are the DF-26 CHSS-18, of which China's got 110. This is China's latest intermediate range ballistic missile. It's got a range of 5,000 kilometers, which means it's essentially intended to target Guam and other Pacific islands that the U.S. Air Force and Navy would use to supply Taiwan in the event of a conflict with China. Each of these carries 10 warheads. They're MIRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, and again, very accurate with 100 circular error probability, 100-meter circular error probability. You can see a map of Guam in the lower right, and you can see a picture of a B-2 bomber escorted by F-15s on the bottom left. This is the DF-21A. This is a CHSS-5 NATO designation, of which there are 80. It's China's latest medium-range ballistic missile. It's got a range of 1,770 kilometers. It carries 5 to 6 warheads with a circular error probability of between 10 meters to up to 700 meters, depending on whether it's guided by satellites. And so this can strike targets in Taiwan, in Japan, in Okinawa, out as far as the Philippines. So it's a versatile system, again, to deal with theater targets in the event of a nuclear war. Here's the DF-21 solid fuel rocket, 500 kilotons. There is an ASAT version of this, an anti-satellite version, and an anti-ship ballistic missile version as well. These are the DF-17 medium-range ballistic missiles, the CHSS-11 NATO designation. They have a range of up to 2,500 kilometers, and a total of 36 of these specialized systems that are intended to launch a hypersonic glide vehicle that flies at a range of Mach 5, which is intended to circumvent U.S. missile defense. Now, the problem with hypersonic vehicles is it's very difficult to turn them because of the inertia. And while they might outrun a U.S. interception system, a much easier method is simply to detonate a high-altitude nuclear warhead, and then all the radars are no longer able to detect the missiles, and then you can launch missiles with a fair amount of certainty that there's not going to be an interception. So it's not entirely clear what the advantage is of having a hypersonic missile. It might be useful to overcome the defense of a ship and then to hit the ship because a ship is expensive. But delivering a nuclear weapon quickly is not any different than delivering a nuclear weapon slowly, because even a slow ballistic missile warhead can come into the atmosphere at 10 times the speed of sound. Here's a CJ-10 ground-launched cruise missile with a range of 1,500 kilometers, and China's got 54 of these. So these can be equipped with nuclear warheads, and China can use them to fire at, say, Japan or South Korea. Here's the CJ-100 ground-launched cruise missile, 2,000-kilometer range, and this particular version fires the hypersonic Mach 4 to 5 missile. This is China's FJ-1 anti-ballistic missile, which was developed in the 1970s. It's still not clear if this has any hope of working. It's an early concept. It looks like it's a rip-off of the American Spartan rocket. So the Chinese were examining the technical possibilities of intercepting incoming missiles, which is something that's very, very difficult to do. These are the main launching sites of China's space program, Taiyuan, Xichang, and Jichuan. China's first man in space was Yang Liwei, who went into space in 2003. Here you can compare the number of satellite launches. China currently has the second largest number of satellites in space after the United States. China surpassed the Soviet Union, which used to be the number one state in terms of the number of satellites in the 1990s. So it very quickly took a lead in launching a large number of satellites. You can see the red on the right side of the screen in terms of the countries with the largest number of satellites. U.S., it looks like here the U.S. is actually behind China in the number of satellites in orbit. It's hard to say from this, but in any case, they're very, very close. So China's got a total of 161 satellites that are dual use, including 9 communications, 45 Baidu GPS navigation satellites. China used to have a 10 about 15 years ago, so they've put their entire system up now. There are 32 surveillance satellites and 67 signals intelligence. In 2007 and 2014, China conducted an anti-satellite test There was a target moving at 7.42 kilometers a second at an altitude of 850 kilometers, and China successfully fired a rocket and intercepted it. So they have proven hit-to-kill technology. In 2012, China's Shenzhou 9 spaceship docked with Tiangong-1 Space Lab, which was proof of concept that China could put basically an orbital space lab that would be in continuous operation. China currently has the Tiangong-3, which is based on their experience with the two previous space labs launched into space. So the People's Liberation Army doctrine was originally defensive with attrition, and this is a view to how to win against a more technological power. China did reasonably well against a more technologically advanced U.S. with naval and air supremacy during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. But in the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet Union emerged as a major threat to China, and the Soviet Union deployed a third of its military in the Far East. What the Soviet Union had a lot of was tactical nuclear weapons, and a lot of nerve gas. And so China's doctrine was to maintain close contact with the Soviets, and so they're less likely to use their tactical nuclear weapons, and to fight them with the very large numbers of reserves the Chinese were ready to deploy. And at the time, the Chinese had trained about 120 million people to fight. So they were essentially going to fight Russian tanks with infantry and try to sustain guerrilla warfare. The losses, of course, would have been horrendous. The Soviet goal was to advance and occupy the northern plain south of Beijing, although getting to Beijing would have been very difficult over the very rugged mountainous terrain between the Soviet border and the Russian Far East and the Chinese capital. So this doctrine was to simply impose a very high cost on an attacker from abroad. China did conceive later of having limited wars under high-tech conditions. It saw how the U.S. defeated Iraq in 1991 and became very aware of the need to adopt high technology. And so the goal with technology is to paralyze the opponent. It's not necessarily to fight them, but to take away their will and to strike them at a range beyond which they can't respond. And so China focused on a number of modernization methods. First, it reduced the conscription to 2 years. It reduced the personnel in the army dramatically. China's military today is less than half of what it was at the end of the Cold War, despite the fact that it has a larger population. China's re-equipped the armed forces with a lot of communications technology and modern aircraft, ships, submarines, and tanks. And it's trying to develop an officer corps and a non-commissioned officer corps that emphasize professionalism as much as political reliability. So China's goal is primarily sea denial rather than sea control. It still doesn't have a navy large enough to take on the U.S. China's got 3 aircraft carriers. The U.S. has got 10. So China's focus is really on Taiwan and the South China Sea and the Kuril Islands. China does a lot of non-combat evacuation operations and anti-piracy operations, patrols as far as the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. China's goal is to maintain commerce, but it doesn't have the ability to secure its sea line of communications beyond its immediate littoral. China, for example, could not operate in the Indian Ocean and oppose the Indian fleet at the same time. What China is developing is a string of pearls, littoral military bases across the oceans where it can deploy its fleets for a short time, and which in the future, if it does have a navy large enough, it'll be able to deploy there and then engage in gunboat diplomacy and basically assert its national interest. It has bases in Djibouti, and in Pakistan at Gwadar. It's got a small logistical facility in Singapore. It's likely to deploy a base in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. It would like a base in Bangladesh. So it's seeking to establish these bases outside of its territory. China is working on an aircraft carrier, but the aircraft carrier and the foreign military bases are fairly provocative and are causing a reaction in the region. So countries are building up opposite China. So countries like Japan are looking at aircraft carriers, light aircraft carriers as well.
China would like to project into the Indian Ocean simply because it obtains the majority of its energy from the Persian Gulf, which is at some distance from Chinese ports.